What's going on, guys? It's Just Crust here, and I'm back with another YouTube video. And today we'll be continuing the Today I Learned. This is, I think, genuinely one of the first times in my entire life where I've had 3 uploads in a row. Or yeah, 3 daily uploads, which is cool. I really kind of like it. I fuck with it. It probably either, I don't know, it might have been accomplished while I was doing fucking thunderstorm interrupting me. It might have been accomplished while I was doing like the Sporkle quizzes, which was also a great time in this channel. um, I also just don't know how to get out particularly. I also just heard something fall. Um, I don't have a shield to protect myself either. But so we got a jam-packed day today. I watched or I went to my normal 2 classes, and then we also watched Monday's Christianity lecture, so I can talk about that too. We'll start with coming to the Civil War. So today we began with the election results, and I don't know if you could have predicted this. So spoilers, Lincoln won. He had, I think it was 180 electoral votes. He had a majority, which for everybody else was kind of an L. Most people, again, the objective was to throw it to the House where they can get a deal done. But so Lincoln won. Breckinridge came in second with like 70 something votes. Bell got like 20 something, and Stephen Douglas got 12. But here's actually something interesting: is that Stephen Douglas had the second most uh, actual overall votes. He was second in the popular vote. It's just that he got a lot of votes in states that Lincoln won. So he only ended up getting, I think he got like Missouri, which is interesting to me. He got Missouri and then like part of New Jersey, and those were his like 12 electoral votes. And so the reaction was about what you expected. Southern and even Northern Democrats were very critical of this entire election. Excuse me. They're very critical of everything that happened during this election. Northern Democrats condemned spoilers. Northern Democrats condemned Republicans still as radicals and as just in general, like, not very good. Southern Democrats went even further. Some of the fire eaters, again, like Rhett and Yancey, I don't remember their first names, went so far as to say, actually, no, by the time of the election, most fire eaters were in the belief, most or a decent amount of that Southern Rights Party. I don't know where I'm going. I need to get to home. So this way, and we'll dig where what. All right, that's for later. Um, most of the fire eaters at this point, or most of the Southern Rights Party, um, declared that basically Lincoln being elected was an act of war, or was a declaration of war, and that they would not stand for his election. And so, I think, again, if you know Civil War history, you can start to assume what's about to happen. So we started talking a lot, or we started our discussion, because this is only 2 classes per week. So we started this discussion with talking about Secession Winter, which is the December of 1860 to around March of 1861. And that is when the first series of secessions happened. It was when the Deep South started to secede. So like South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Missouri, Florida, etc. Particularly, we covered 2 cases. We covered the case of South Carolina, and we covered the case of Georgia today. South Carolina has, for its entire existence, give me 1 second. Sorry, I just kind of wanted to get situated on a track to get back to my house. So basically, we started with South Carolina. South Carolina, ever since the days of Calhoun, and the nullification crisis, has been a hotbed for secession and other like disunion rhetoric. And so it's no surprise that they were the leaders of all secession movements, particularly. Um, and the talks of secession in South Carolina were obviously, again, started before he was even elected. Um, but they were just enraged by his election, and the talks were escalated extremely quickly to where by December, literally a month after the election, they had called an election of their own to elect people to the Secession Council. And the Secession Council was going to vote on whether or not South Carolina should secede from the Union or not. Which, again, if you know history, you can probably assume what their results were. Um, South Carolina was an interesting case in the Deep South, though, because while most of the Deep South states had a elite planting class as well as yeomans, as well as the normal average like family farmer, um, South Carolina was different. First off, they were the only state in which, at least for most of antebellum period, I'm pretty sure this was still true into the Civil War. South Carolina was the only state with a black majority of the population, meaning that there were more, at this point, there were more slaves in the state than white people. And because of that, South Carolina was like had a lot more fears about anti-slavery. Hold on. Well, yeah, anti-slavery abolition efforts. They were very afraid of what was to come and what could come from the election of Lincoln, from Republican ideals, and this was true in most of the Deep South, but also especially, like specifically or especially in South Carolina, um, free speech was completely not real. They were actively suppressing abolition movements and abolition like pamphlets and stories, like such as Uncle Tom's Cabin, and the likes. Which not particularly surprising, I guess. Again, if you know like American history, it's not surprising. Um, excuse me. Um, but they elected an entire council. They elected 169 voters to vote on the issue if South Carolina should secede from the Union or not. And the result was 169 to 0 saying yes. And so there you go. South Carolina was officially the first state to vote on secession. Oh, what the? How? I'm at like elevation 9. What? Um, they were the first state to vote on secession, and they were also the first state to officially secede. Which was, and wow, that was generally expected from South Carolina, just due to, again, their demographic. They were very, very stocked to the brim of elite planners. There's just nothing in here. Okay, that's cool, though. This is a neat little area. Um, their population was stocked to the brim of elite planners. They didn't have even a semblance of a middle class, which was in difference to Georgia. Georgia was Georgia was the other opposite, the opposite side of that spectrum for oh yo, kind of sick, kind of poggers. Um, I'm both strip mining and trying to get my way back home. But Georgia was different. Oh, Georgia had a very. Why can't I put lava down? Oh, I see why now. I see why now. Um, Georgia had a very large yeoman population, actually. More so than any other deep South state, I'm pretty sure. Just due to the simple fact that there's a mountainous region within Georgia that was not suitable for the planting of cotton, because Georgia was the cotton of like the eastern deep South. Georgia was the primary cotton producer, and so winning the South, or yeah, winning Georgia would be a gigantic win for the South. Um, but they had a large yeoman population that had like owned very little to no slaves at all, and so they would have to be convinced basically that secession was the right option, and that's exactly what happened basically. Or that was like that there were campaigns to convince the yeoman, and how it ended up was, first off, after South Carolina won, they sent out like secession commissioners and like some of their electorate to other southern states to rally for secession. Like they sent some to Richmond, they sent some to obviously Georgia. And also, hold on, it didn't help that in South Carolina, the vote was held in Charleston, which was known as the hub of secession, like, or the hub of fire eaters. Like, Charleston was like undeniably like very radical from the very beginning. Um, so holding it had to be moved from another city that it was in. Like it was in a more neutral site, but it had to be moved due to fears of an epidemic. I think it was like smallpox or something. Um, and so it got moved to Charleston, the center of fire eaters, basically. And in Georgia, it was the vote was closer. They also decided that they needed to vote on it. And South Carolina, again, and other ralliers brought in their commissioners. They brought in some of their voters to try to convince. And then Georgia politicians also um, did a lot of rallying to the yeoman class. They did a lot of rallying to the general public, the people who live in the mountains, people who aren't growing the staple crops. They're not, excuse me, they're not participating in the planter class. Um, they had to, basically, the Georgian elites had to preach to the common man and tell them why secession was best. Now, what was also interesting was that, unlike in South Carolina, um, secession was a much more nuanced issue in Georgia. Is that there was actually a divide of people who wanted secession in the first place. There was two different ideologies. There were immediatist secessionists, which believe that secession should have been immediate and like they should secede like yesterday. But then there were conditional unionists, because basically the people who weren't going to succeed were called unionists or unconditional unionists. The other side of the secession argument, away from the immediatists, are the conditional unionists. And basically what they're doing, what the conditional unionists said was that we should, like, seceding is the absolute last resort. We should not secede unless it's absolutely necessary. Like, come on. And that instead that they should try to leverage their way into getting a compromise, such as leveraging their way into getting personal liberty laws banned, or leverage their way into slavery, legalizing the slave codes, like re-legalizing slavery everywhere, or at least like trying to reconstitute the Missouri Compromise line, such stuff like that. Basically, they understood that disunion was absolutely awful and should be the last thing anybody like wanted. So they tried to leverage it as much as they could into an advantage for the South. It's just that the North obviously was not playing for it at the time. The North didn't want to hear it because the election results, if you're like, the Northern Republicans were pretty psyched, obviously. Abolitionists were relatively okay with it. They found that this was, it's a step in the right direction. You got somebody who was openly against the spread of slavery, which is better than you could have said for Pierce or Buchanan. Which Buchanan fucking sucked as president. Like, we'll get to that at the end. basically, I should also, I've spent like 15 minutes talking about it. I should probably wrap up this section because we still got 2 more classes to talk about. Um, so Georgia, after campaigning to the yeoman, um, held their election. And it was a lot closer than South Carolina's. It was voted 208 to like 83 or something like that in favor of secession. Which again, that still means they will succeed, or they will secede or succeed in seceding. But very close, very close, much closer than anything South Carolina would have ever had. So what does this mean, and what is going? What's going to happen? Well, the president was James Buchanan, so nothing. James Buchanan, as the lame duck president, basically as a president who there's already a president-elect. He is on his way out of office. There's only a couple more months until his term is over. What is he going to do? And the answer probably won't surprise you. The answer is he did nothing. The answer is that he felt that while secession was unconstitutional, there was nothing he could do about it. And there was nothing that he was going to do about it. And there's nothing that he could try to do to make it, to stop states from seceding, stop, like, South Carolina, Georgia, and all of them. There's nothing he could do to stop that, and there's nothing he was going to do to stop the further secession of other states. He did nothing. And that's kind of where we left off, is that states were starting to secede, and James Buchanan, the 15th president, did nothing to stop them, and did nothing to... He did nothing but further stroke the flames of secession by allowing it to continue happening. And even, like, Abraham Lincoln was pretty mum on the whole secession issue. Abraham Lincoln was, like, I believe what we kind of agreed on was that he was still hopeful for compromise. He was still hopeful that there could be compromise in the future. But in general, during his, like, when he was president-elect, when he was not in office but was known to be the 16th president, he didn't say much. He was fucking doing nothing. He was vibing, per se. And basically, we're going to have to wait and see how this ends, or how secession winter turned into secession spring the next week. And it's going to talk about basically the Upper South and how they came to the secession, how they came to terms with their secession. Because obviously, the secession rhetoric was very common in the Deep South, in Cotton Kingdom, but it wasn't particularly common, or at least, like, not as common in, like, Virginia and Tennessee and stuff like that. So next week it's going to be covered a lot, basically, of how that evolved, and how did it evolve, and how did they get to that decision of secession. So our next class that I had was economic history, and today we talked still more about postbellum economics in America, and specifically, I don't know, I don't, there wasn't a particularly, like, unified idea that I could glean from today. There was a lot. Actually, well, the biggest thing that we took away was at the end of class, and basically, cotton was getting to be unproductive, and okay, well, here I've kind of jogged my memory with that, like, singular line. Basically, we discussed more of the South specifically, and how, again, the narrative, again, since I've been going to school my whole life, the narrative was South fell behind, South is mid, like, South's not doing enough, like, South fell behind, South fell off, like, ratio. But that's not particularly the case. As I covered on Monday, or as I relayed to you all on Monday, the South, like, barring the literal years which they were losing a civil war, they kept up with the North's growth, like, step for step. They kept up and were keeping up the growth. And even in the places that they weren't particularly growing in the 1880s or such, like that time frame, by 1900, by 1910, they had caught up, or like were in the process of like catching up pretty quickly, relative. Like I believe they went from like urbanization rates like in 1880 actually went down to more like I think like maybe 15%, like compared to the rest of the United States, like only 15% of their land or of their cities was urbanized, versus in 1910 I believe it was nearly 50%. um and just kind of stuff like that, where it's like the South, there was definitely, the South was behind, but the gap was not widening. And that's like the main, that's a very important thing to note, is that while the South did fall behind, and a lot of it was a lot of it was based on the cotton market. The cotton market in the 1860s had a gigantic boom. The cotton kingdom, or that is why, that boom is why there was a cotton kingdom. The growth rate within the cotton economy was absurd. And the South had, I believe, in the United States, and by the United States, in the South, um, they were the market, or in the global cotton trade, they were, I think, in the 1850s, like 70 something percent of the UK's Britain, or of the UK's cotton supply. Ridiculous. They held an enormous share in the cotton market. But in the 60s, during, the fucking Civil War, um, shoot, I should stop cursing. Like, maybe, during, a civil war, Britain embargoed their cotton. Britain was not going to buy cotton from the Confederacy. So their share went down to like 15% during the 60s, I believe. And then it was slow to pick back up, and they did not recover it completely until like the 1900s. It got to the point again where, um, by like 1880, there was they only had recovered like maybe 35% of Britain's market, because Britain was buying cotton from other places like Brazil and Egypt, I believe. And like that was the whole story, or that was a not the whole story at all. That's part of a story. Is that um, the South fell further behind because at that time their staple, cotton was the staple crop at the time, their staple fell off. The growth, or the demand was growing at a much slower rate than it was during the antebellum period. And that's, them's the breaks. Like, it was a lot. And even by the time that they did recapture the Britain share, like I believe they, by 1900, or like 1910, they were back up to being Britain's like main squeeze by and far. Like again, back to the like the roughly like 75%. But cotton's market was growing at like maybe a percent a year instead of the normal insane growth. And what we also talked about was the biological changes. Uh, the biology, basically, cotton became so productive. I've thrown away all my cobble. What the hell? Um, it became so productive due to just different advancements at different times, like the technology aspect is the most obvious one. The cotton gin made it so one person who normally would pick 1 pound a day, or pick and clean, because the cleaning was a big part, pick and clean 1 pound of cotton a day, with the cotton gin could pick and clean 50 pounds of cotton a day. Because the cotton, again, this is one part that I really know too much about, because we talked a fuck ton about it. Basically, upland cotton, the main cotton grown in like the 30s and 40s, was very easy to grow, very amicable with most soils, versus Sea Island cotton, which was our first cotton, like our first venture into the cotton industry, was on Sealand cotton. Sealand cotton needs extremely moist soil. Like it was only grown on like the Sea Islands of Georgia, particularly. Georgia, maybe like South Carolina as well. Which that was cool, I guess. Like, but upland cotton, while it was much easier to grow and much, again, more cooperative with the soil conditions of mainland America, it still was inefficient for other reasons, such as it had a lot of seeds, and the seeds were very tedious and difficult to pick out, to the point where only a person can only pick and clean 1 pound of cotton a day. I already have enough copper. Um, so again, the advancements in technology, such as the cotton gin, rose productivity like a genuinely like fucking insane amount. And then I'm gonna throw away string. I don't need string. And then there was biological enhancement. They got a new type of cotton. They got Mexican cotton. And Mexican cotton grew bigger balls, grew more balls, and less seeds. So the cotton gin was kind of like, I don't believe it was particularly necessary for Mexican cotton anymore. But it grew bigger, faster, and stronger, and they grew more. So that was a gigantic productivity boost. Um, it was incredible. Productivity, the market, or the productivity in cotton was growing. I don't even know the number. It was a very insane. It was by far America's most productive industry. Like growth wise, it was growing at the fastest pace. Like, that would have been really bad. Growing at a genuinely ridiculous rate. Um, but that slowed down. And why did that slow down? It's just that with those innovations, the technology and the biology, when that stopped, it grew at the rate of a normal industry, or even slower than that. Because by the time of like the 1850s and 1860s, most upland cotton was replaced by Mexican cotton. That's just a fact. Most, like, they had done almost all the planting needed to have the most productive. I'm still trying to find my house, by the way, which I'm going in the right Z direction. All right, so I need to, like, this way, I think, like, roughly. Um, they had all of it planted, and so there was no more productivity gains to be had because it was already, it had reached nearby, like damn near perfect efficiency. Um, Everything was as productive as it could be relatively. You were using the most technology with the cotton gin, and you were using um your the best cotton available with your the Mexican cotton. So that just means the market stagnated, or that means the productivity growth in the market stagnated, and it stagnated hard, and it stagnated fast. And what did that do? It screwed the South. The South's main uh the South's main sector is agriculture. And their main way to make money was agriculture sector was the wheat, or it wasn't, spoilers, was the cotton industry. So having your main staple become completely have a completely stagnated market, it screwed them. It screwed the South. To the point where by the 1870s and the 1880s, agriculture was one of their weakest sectors. Agriculture was bringing in not as much money, yet there was still so much resources allocated to the growth of cotton and stuff like that. It's a really interesting conundrum that the South were in, is that the market that they were the most dependent on was the weakest. It was not financially a viable option anymore. Um, so it should be like, so it should be this way nearly. Um, it was a really interesting situation for the South to be in, to where um, the South was industrializing, and their industrial market was more, or it was like seemed at least to be more viable than agriculture due to the cotton industry failing. And we touched on at the end of class. We basically just we discussed. I can't tell that. Oh boy. I can't tell particularly what that noise was, if it was like my chair or something. But and then at the end of class we discussed the rise of a new staple. If you didn't know, in the staple crop is basically a cash crop, and it revolutionizes the sector. In the 1600s to 1700s, the cash crop, the main staple of American agriculture, was tobacco. And then there was a couple other like middling staples, such as rice and indigo, particularly in the Carolinas and Georgia and such. But the next main global staple, the one that took off like tobacco took off, was cotton. And we saw that lasted all throughout the 1800s. The cotton was the staple of the 19th century. But in the 1880s onward, you can see the growth and you can see the inklings of, oh, there she is. My house. I actually have to dig up too. Like, I need to get wood and other materials. It was very interesting to see that there was a new character on the scene. There was a rise in there was a new man in town. There was a new BMOC, a new big man on campus. And it was wheat. And you think, wheat? Yeah, wheat. It was wheat. Wheat had always been a interesting sector in the Midwest, in the states of like Iowa and I don't know, the Dakotas, Nebraska, I guess. It was a very Midwest crop, where they had arid soil comparable to the soil that was used to grow cotton. Wheat was always grown. I believe, like in the antebellum period, wheat was like our third biggest crop behind like cotton and like rice, something like that. Excuse me, but there was an interesting like revolution that happened, or there was a lot of things that just so happened to happen at the same time that precipitated wheat's boom onto our market. Wheat was, by and large, by the 20th century, our best crop. And we discussed why. And it was a really interesting turn of events to where railroads were expanding like never before seen. Investment post-Civil War, due to the boom of the capital market, investment was booming. So people were investing more into railroads. Therefore, more railroads were built, connecting east and west, connecting north and south, north and west, connecting America. So, alongside that, the cost of transport itself was cheap, or was cheapening at a much faster rate than before. From 1880 to 1900, land travel became exponentially cheaper, which benefited our markets, and which benefited the railroads specifically, and benefited wheat a lot. It benefited wheat a lot. And within that, we have one more factor, and it was the cost of transatlantic travel. Because wheat had always been a very important domestic crop. But more important than that, to become, a stable cash crop, you have to be able to sell it to the international market. The cost of transatlantic travel also steeply declined. It was the cost of all of these travels at the same time, all declining rapidly due to technological innovations of one way or another, that helped wheat become a big staple for America. That and land availability. This is one of the main themes of the entire class, is that we as America got really lucky. Oh, nice, I can sleep. We as America got super lucky with a sheer amount of land, because in every step of the way, our developments and our economic viability has been based purely on land. There's such a land abundance. And And that helped with wheat again. Wheat was easy to grow. It was pretty quick. You could grow a lot of it. And wheat, every step of the way, was efficient because of Cyrus McCormick. This was on my exam and I got it right. Barely, somehow. I was a shot in the dark. Cyrus McCormick made the horse-drawn steel reaper. Basically, it was very efficient. It was the set of technological booms in the same vein as the cotton gin, which increased productivity. Productivity is one of the most important things of any market. And in the case of wheat, steel, the horse-drawn reaper was one of the most important parts. And then, while all this was happening, again, and while all the transportation was happening, obviously Europe wants wheat. Europe, especially the UK, doesn't have a ton of farmland. The United States is much bigger than almost all of those countries and could produce a lot. We had a ton of land dedicated to agriculture. So what we do, we see that transcontinental travel is steeply declining in price. Transcontinental travel is also, I don't know, I guess, transatlantic travel is also steepening, or dropping off, my bad. Transatlantic travel is also dropping off. We have tons of land dedicated to the growth of wheat. So, we flood Europe's markets with wheat. It's just that simple. We literally we flood their market with wheat. And that's what happens, is we're selling them wheat basically faster than they can consume it, but they need it. Everybody needs wheat. And so all of those factors made wheat the crop, the staple of early 20th century into 1800 or 1880s to 1900s due to all of those traveling things. And that's where we ended. And I thought that was really interesting, actually. I learned this is like half of a botany class at this point. Again, we spent a whole class talking about the structure of cotton, and I'm not gonna lie and say it wasn't interesting. I don't know. I was intrigued. I now know how to talk about upland versus sea island versus Mexican cotton. It's pretty cool. And now, religion. Monday's class, because I watched it now. Monday's class was about the Acts of John. There wasn't a whole lot to really glean from this lecture. Basically, my professor considers this, or the Acts of John in general, I believe is apocryphal, which is not part of the Christian canon. And she adds this just in general as another section of the Johannine universe of stories, which is the early Christians basically loved John. They absolutely loved John. They decided that John was the beloved disciple. They also decided that he wrote not only the Gospel of John, which they still considered from the Gospel of John for him to be considered the beloved disciple. They also believed that he was the author of Revelations and also letters attributed to John, such as 1 John, 2 John, etc., etc. Scholars, early Christian scholars, don't particularly believe that. They don't particularly agree. But it's neat. It's neat to think about. We talked about within the Acts of John, we don't have a concrete copy of it. With the Gospels, the Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of all of them, we have concrete copies. We have copies that we know, from the 3rd and 4th century. I'm building on my chest. Why would I do that? We have concrete from 3rd and 4th century at latest. Even we have Gospel of Mark. We have earlier. We have much earlier. That are direct, exact copies. Perfect. The Acts of John as a whole, we don't. We do not have a singular copy. We're putting together a lot of different smaller bits into the Acts of John. So that's called extant. We don't have extant versions of the Gospel of John, but we found fragments that are extant. We have found historical 3rd and 4th century pieces that fit into an Act of John. Um, excuse me, that water went down a lot. The Acts of John particularly consists most of a section that was found called Acts of John, um, Metastasis, and then Virtus Ioannis, I think. I don't know, it's Latin. Basically, Metastasis is his death. Acts of John is what he does when he's vibing. And then the other one, I don't know. But basically, within these acts, John raises Cleopatra, a random girl, not the Egyptian leader, from the dead, converts her to Christianity, destroys the temple of Artemis, converts the population to Christianity. That isn't particularly, they can't like line up a particular, they can't like confirm that around like 100 CE or so. Excuse me, they can't particularly confirm that somebody destroyed the Temple of Artemis around that time. But like, hey, go for it, I guess, or whatever. Fucking try it, I guess. And then John converts a woman named Drusiana to Christianity. However, what's interesting about this is that we don't know that we don't have an exact like fragment from this. The only reason that it's included, because like the Acts of John that we have is only extant things for the most part. But we've included this because later in Acts of John it mentions Drusiana, and like basically we know that she has to be converted at some point. And then John, as an old man, gets his disciples to dig a grave, and he goes in it and dies. We kind of talked a little bit about John is interesting in the fact that not only is he the beloved disciple, or at least believed to be the beloved disciple, he also isn't martyred. He doesn't die like the rest. He doesn't get killed by the Romans, or doesn't get killed by anybody else. He dies in natural causes. He was 100 when he died, roughly. And we discussed the ramifications of that. We talked about why. Why would you think that John wasn't going to be martyred? Comparative to like Peter and Paul and I don't know, all of them else, all the other disciples, like James, his fucking brother. Oh, we're close. Wow, I dug up like under a tree. Okay. We don't particularly know, or like I don't particularly know. I thought it was pretty interesting. There's notes throughout the gospel, particularly Gospel of. There are notes within Gospels that have Jesus basically making a commentary and saying, like, I think Peter asks. Peter's like, "That's your beloved disciple, yo. Like, is he gonna die?" And or like, because they were talking about the betrayal, and Peter was like, "What about him? Is he gonna die?" Because like Jesus had just told him he's gonna Peter's gonna get martyred. Peter will die, and so Peter was concerned, and Peter looked and it was like, "It's okay. Like if I'm gonna die, like what the fuck? Like what about like that dude?" And he pointed at my man, John, and Jesus said in relative terms, I'm not a religious man. No, he's not going to get martyred. He probably won't. As long as I will him to live, or as long as I will him to be around for my second coming, I will. He will not be martyred. And so Peter was obviously like, "What the fuck? Like, why? Why do I have to be martyred then?" But like, that's not the point. There are in the Acts of John, there are multiple scenes of him being martyred. He just doesn't die though. That's the difference. Is he gets martyred, but he doesn't die from being martyred. He gets charged by the Romans, and he drinks poison. But he lives, and he gets charged by the Romans again, and they charge him and tell him to boil in oil, and he lives again. And though there's some belief by like researchers and Christian scholars that like those are kind of included to say like, hey, see, like John got martyred like the rest of them. John was also a martyr at this point. But he didn't die from martyring. He died of natural causes at age 100 when he told his disciples dig a grave. He got in the grave and fucking died. It's an interesting note. I don't know. And then I don't know, common themes, or like one thing that I actually found interesting. I didn't particularly read the Gospel of John all the way through. I was like, well, whatever. One thing I found interesting when I was hearing my professor talk about the Gospel of John. All right, well, I didn't read the Gospel of John or Acts of John. I didn't read either of them all the way through. Um, but, um, but specifically, one neat thing about the Acts of John is it has a lot of allusions to Gospels. It has a lot of allusion to the Gospel of Mark and Matthew and the other ones. As it's showing it's showing him, or showing what happens in the Gospel through his perspective, instead of like a first person perspective, rather than, or like a first person retelling, rather than just like the general overview, like that it did with Jesus. Which I thought was actually really interesting. I didn't like expect that or know that. Um, so that's cool, I guess. I'm gonna take only as many as I can handle. No homo. Um, also going to make 3 chests probably. So yeah, that's kind of like that's what we talked about. We talked a lot about motherfucking John. We talked about the Acts of John. Which is always cool, kind of. And like we talked about some themes, like there's a lot of shape shifting of Jesus. Like that's a theme of like people seeing Jesus, and then next time they see him, he's in a different shape or form, stuff like that. Which I again, I'm gonna say this over and over. I'm not a religious person, so like I don't know. My views on this are very like surface level. I found that interesting. I thought it was cool. I thought it was unique that like he wasn't seen as, or like I don't know, it's just a side of Jesus that like I don't particularly see often. um, One of he's fucking shape shifting. Um, I found that cool. I don't know. Was interesting also in his retelling of all the gospels. I wrote this down. I have the notes in front of me because it's literally like a page. Like I don't know. I don't half the time. I don't even need to take notes for this class. Um, there was no Last Supper from John's retelling of the gospel. There was only they like danced, and that's what I thought was actually like the weirdest thing is that they danced instead. They instead of doing like a big Last Supper, they all like stood and like all the apostles like got around Jesus and they danced and they sang to him. That's interesting. It was weird. Um, Acts of John is not like other apocryphal texts. Other apocryphal texts were widely accepted by the Christian faith and passed through and facilitated. And were again some like were even in different canons for a long time. Acts of John were explicitly condemned by the Christian Church. Um, Quote, rejected as a fiction of heretics. And it was rejected alongside the Acts of like Matthias and the Act of Thomas. Excuse me. And they also disputed the writings of John, letters and revelations specifically. Because John, if you believe what some early Christians believed, got around. He wrote a lot. Um, I don't know, but I just thought that was all. I thought that was pretty cool. Um, and that's I think where we're ending today. I don't have much more to say on any of these classes. So if you enjoyed, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. I'd like some feedback. I'd like to continue doing this and seeing any support or any interaction or viewing makes me know that I should continue to do this and that it's worthwhile. Um, and again, I'm also again doing it for me. I enjoy doing this. I enjoy recounting everything I've learned. Again, I enjoy teaching relatively. I'm not a teacher. I'm not an educator. I'm not qualified to teach any of these subjects yet. So don't take what I say as final. Please understand that this is my interpretation of whatever I'm learning. So like sometimes, as everybody does in life, I interpret things wrong. Please do not take what I say as face value. This is how I interpret things. And again, people interpret things wrong sometimes. So like, don't. I'm not the end all be all. I do not have a degree in history. I don't have a degree in math. I don't have a degree in religious studies. So don't take what I say as the end all be all. Thank you. And thanks so much for watching.